Field Marshal Albert Kesselring looked at the map of the Italian front and felt a cold strike of disbelief. His intelligence officers had reported the American 3rd Infantry was still 10 miles away, but the shells were already falling on his headquarters. It was May 1944. The Anzio breakout had begun 72 hours earlier. According to every calculation, every military manual, every standard march rate in the Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine, American infantry could not possibly have covered that distance in 3 days. The terrain was terrible. The resistance was heavy. The mud alone should have stopped them. But the Americans were there, artillery ranging in on German positions that were supposed to be safely behind the front lines. Kesselring demanded an explanation. His staff had none. What they did not know yet was that they were not fighting a standard American general. They were fighting Lucian Truscott. And Truscott did not believe in standard march rates. The German High Command in Italy had been tracking American generals for months. They knew Patton. Everyone knew Patton. Loud, aggressive, theatrical. He telegraphed his movements through press conferences and personal appearances. German intelligence could predict where Patton would attack because Patton wanted them to know. It was psychological warfare. The Germans had developed counter-tactics specifically designed for Patton's armored charges. Concentrate anti-tank defenses. Prepare killing zones. Let him attack into prepared positions. It worked often enough. But while the world was watching Patton's ivory-handled revolvers, the Germans were looking at a stopwatch, and it was moving twice as fast as it should. Lucian Truscott was not theatrical. He was systematic. He didn't give speeches about blood and guts. He gave his men training standards that sounded insane, and then enforced them until those standards became muscle memory. The Truscott trot. 5 miles per hour for the first hour of a march. 4 miles per hour for every hour after that. Full combat load. Full equipment, day or night, rain or shine. Allied standard march rate was 2.5 miles per hour with scheduled rest breaks. Truscott's men moved at double that pace, and they didn't stop. When he took command of the 3rd Infantry Division, soldiers thought it was punishment. When they fought in North Africa and Sicily, they understood it was preparation. When they broke out from Anzio in May 1944, the Germans understood it was a weapon they had no defense against. German doctrine was built on the standard march rate. Defensive planning calculated how far enemy forces could advance in a given time period. If the enemy was 10 miles away and a standard infantry march rate was 2.5 miles per hour, German forces had 4 hours to prepare defensive positions before contact. That calculation worked against British forces. It worked against most American units. It was a mathematical certainty based on human physical limitations. Lucian Truscott did not just break that rate. He deleted it from the equation. His infantry covered distances in time frames that German planning staff refused to believe even after reports were confirmed. They assumed the intelligence was wrong. The Americans must be using trucks. There must be a mistake in the distance calculations. The alternative was accepting that American soldiers could simply walk faster than German defensive doctrine could accommodate. The 3rd Infantry Division arrived in Italy in September 1943. German intelligence noted their presence and filed standard threat assessments. Another American infantry division, well-trained but inexperienced in European combat. Expected performance was methodical advances, heavy reliance on artillery support, and vulnerability to aggressive counterattacks. Within 2 weeks, those assessments were being rewritten. The 3rd Division was advancing at rates that suggested armor support. Intelligence confirmed they were infantry. Pure leg infantry covering terrain at speeds that violated every assumption about human endurance. German commanders requested clarification. The reports were accurate. The Americans were simply marching faster than any infantry unit the Germans had previously encountered. The engineers in Berlin had calculated exactly how long a retreat should take. German elastic defense doctrine relied on trading space for time. Establish a defensive line, hold until pressure becomes overwhelming, and execute a planned withdrawal to the next prepared position. The withdrawal timeline was calculated based on how fast pursuing enemy forces could advance. Standard infantry moved at 2.5 miles per hour. Mechanized forces were faster, but limited by fuel and by terrain. The calculations had worked in North Africa. They had worked in Sicily. They were precise, mathematical, reliable. They had not accounted for the Truscott trot. When German forces executed planned withdrawals from positions in Italy, they arrived at their next defensive line to find American infantry already there. Not mechanized cavalry, not paratroopers. Regular infantry, who had simply walked faster than the German retreat, could run. Field Marshal Kesselring was a professional soldier who had fought on multiple fronts. He understood armored warfare. He understood air power. He understood combined arms coordination. What he struggled to understand was how American infantry could consistently appear where his staff calculated they could not possibly be. The reports from subordinate commanders grew increasingly frustrated. American forces were bypassing strong points not through clever maneuver, but through simple speed. German defenders would prepare positions to block an expected American advance. By the time the positions were ready, American forces had already passed them and were attacking from the rear. The defensive timeline was collapsing because the Americans moved at a tempo that broke the mathematical models German planning relied on. By the second day of the Anzio breakout, the German 14th Army was not just losing ground. They were losing their ability to establish coherent defensive lines. Kesselring ordered fallback positions prepared at specific locations calculated to be beyond American reach for another 48 hours. American forces reached those positions in 24 hours. He ordered supply dumps relocated to safe distances behind the front. American patrols appeared before the supplies could be moved. The standard defensive doctrine of trading space for time required knowing how much time you had. Against Truscott's forces, that calculation was impossible because his infantry did not move at standard rates. The German perspective on American generals was nuanced. They respected Eisenhower as an organizer. They feared Patton's armored columns. They studied Bradley's methodical approach. But when German field commanders wrote reports about the most dangerous American operational commander in Italy, they did not name any of those men. They named Lucian Truscott, not because he was brilliant in the traditional sense, but because he had solved a problem that German doctrine considered solved: the problem of infantry speed. Every army knew that infantry could only march so fast before exhaustion degraded combat effectiveness. Truscott had simply redefined what fast meant and trained his men until that new definition became sustainable. The comparison to Patton was inevitable and, from the German perspective, unfavorable to Patton. Patton was a storm, violent, destructive, but ultimately predictable. You could see Patton coming. You could hear him coming. You could prepare for him. Truscott was a flood, silent, relentless, appearing in places you thought were safe. German commanders prepared for Patton's theatrical armor charges by concentrating anti-tank defenses and accepting that the initial assault would be violent, but could be contained. They had no preparation for Truscott's infantry arriving at speeds that should not be possible and continuing to advance when German forces expected them to be consolidating positions. Operation Diadem, May 1944. The Allied offensive to break the stalemate in Italy. Truscott commanded 6th Corps at Anzio. His mission was to break out from the beachhead and drive toward Rome. German forces had contained Anzio for 4 months. They were confident in their defensive positions. Kesselring calculated that even if the Americans broke through the initial defensive line, German forces would have time to execute planned withdrawals and establish new positions. The math was simple: distance between defensive lines, standard American advance rate, time available for German forces to relocate. The calculations were based on solid tactical doctrine and 2 years of combat experience. They were completely wrong. May 23rd, the breakout began. 6th Corps smashed through German defensive positions with concentrated artillery and aggressive infantry assault. German forces executed their planned withdrawal. They fell back to prepared positions 6 miles behind the initial line. Standard doctrine. By the time they reached those positions, Truscott's lead elements were already there. The German forces had withdrawn at standard march rate. Truscott's men had advanced at trot speed. The defensive position was overrun before it could be fully manned. Kesselring ordered a second withdrawal to positions 12 miles back. Surely the Americans could not maintain that pace. They could. They did. By May 26, 3 days into the offensive, 6th Corps had advanced 40 miles. German defensive doctrine had no response to that rate of advance. Positions that were supposed to be safe were being attacked. Supply lines that were calculated to be behind German lines were being cut. Headquarters that should have had days of warning were coming under artillery fire. The 14th Army was disintegrating, not because it was being defeated in battle, but because it could not retreat faster than American infantry could advance. The fundamental assumption of elastic defense, that defenders could trade space for time by withdrawing faster than attackers could pursue, had failed against an enemy who simply walked faster. The frantic German retreat became a case study in how operational tempo could shatter defensive doctrine. Kesselring issued orders for defensive stands at multiple positions. Each position was overrun before it could be properly established. He ordered supply dumps relocated. They were captured before they could be moved. He ordered communication centers repositioned to safe distances. They were shelled before they could complete relocation. Every calculation of safe distance and available time was based on standard march rates. Truscott's forces operated at double that standard. The math did not work. The doctrine did not work. The defensive plan collapsed under pressure from an enemy who simply refused to move at the speed German planners expected. Specific reports from Kesselring's headquarters documented the tactical nightmare. One report noted that American infantry had covered 32 miles in 48 hours over difficult terrain while maintaining combat effectiveness. The German staff officer who wrote the report added a note questioning whether the distance measurement was accurate because that rate of advance seemed impossible for leg infantry. Another report described American forces appearing in German rear areas before defensive positions could be established. The report's conclusion was stark. Standard defensive timing calculations do not apply against this American corps. Plan all withdrawals assuming enemy advance at double standard rate. June 4, 1944. Rome fell. 6th Corps entered the city ahead of other Allied forces, despite having a longer distance to travel. Truscott had turned the advance into a race and won through simple, sustained speed. The liberation of Rome made headlines worldwide. Eisenhower and other senior commanders received credit. Truscott was mentioned, but not prominently. He did not seek publicity. He did not give dramatic speeches. He had simply marched his men faster than anyone thought possible and broken the German defensive line through sustained operational tempo rather than tactical brilliance. The results spoke for themselves, even if Truscott did not. The final verdict came from Kesselring himself in post-war interviews and captured documents. When asked which Allied commander he considered most dangerous in Italy, he did not hesitate. Lucian Truscott. Not because of tactical innovation or strategic genius, because Truscott had identified a single metric that German defensive doctrine relied on, the standard infantry march rate, and systematically exceeded it until German planning became useless. Kesselring noted that against Patton, you could prepare defenses based on known armor capabilities and fuel logistics. Against Truscott, there was no preparation, because his infantry moved at speeds that defensive doctrine said were unsustainable. They were sustainable. Truscott had proven it through training and demonstrated it through results. The tragedy for historical memory is that loudness gets remembered while effectiveness gets footnoted. Patton's theatrical personality made him famous. His ivory-handled revolvers and profane speeches became iconic. Truscott's systematic destruction of German defensive doctrine through superior march rates became a tactical case study, but not a cultural memory. The Germans knew better. They feared the storm they could see coming. But they had nightmares about the flood that simply appeared where it shouldn't be possible. Kesselring's staff calculated defensive timelines based on physics and human endurance. Truscott had different calculations. And when the German math met the Truscott trot, German defensive doctrine broke. The comparison wasn't really between Truscott and Patton. It was between what theatrical aggression could achieve and what systematic excellence could accomplish. Patton won battles through shock and audacity. Truscott won campaigns through sustained tempo that broke defensive mathematics. German generals prepared for Patton by concentrating forces and accepting heavy initial combat. They had no preparation for Truscott because preparation required time, and Truscott never gave them enough. He didn't just beat them, he outwalked them. 5 miles per hour for the first hour, 4 miles per hour thereafter. Full combat load, no exceptions. The Truscott trot wasn't just training. It was the weapon that convinced German field marshals that some American commanders were worse than Patton, because at least you could see Patton coming.